Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Deborah Diamond, the Elizabeth Moynihan Curator for South Asian and Southeast Asian Art here at the museum. Tonight, on behalf of the Freer Research Center, which organizes illuminating symposia, publications, research fellowships, and lectures for scholars, emerging scholars, all of you, here at the National Museum of Asian Art, it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening for a book talk and signing by William Dalrymple. William will discuss his groundbreaking new work, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. And we are especially honored to host William on the very first day of the book's release in the United States as he kicks off his North American tour. Many of you here tonight have been, like me, avidly reading William Dalrymple since his first book, City of Jinns, in 1993. Since then, he has received many, many awards for his 9 books about India, about South Asia, and about the world. My favorite works, I think, are those on the Mughals and the East India Company, a trilogy that reveal how deftly, really, like masterfully, he combines individual stories and looks into emotional lives with well-grounded research that just opens sort of new avenues for thinking about the past, and you'll see that in tonight's talk. In addition to his many books, he is a public intellectual. He writes regularly for The Guardian, The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books. I'm recommending to you his reviews of art exhibitions. They're the best. He is one of the founders of the Jaipur Literary Festival, which has had such a huge impact on South Asian culture. And most recently, with Anita Anand, he has created Empire, a history podcast that is both popular and profound, and it has just passed its 250th episode. The historian Maya Jasanoff wrote that William Dalrymple, I'm just trying to pronounce his name like Scottish people, William Dalrymple, researches like a historian, thinks like an anthropologist, and writes like a novelist. I want to add that he looks at visual culture like an art historian, like a very good art historian. He treats visual culture, architecture, sculptures, paintings, not only as an archive, but as sources of wonder in themselves. And for that reason, that's why he has curated exhibitions such as his Forgotten Masters Indian Painting for the East India Company, which was at the Wallace Collection in London. So anyway, everyone, please settle in. Tonight's talk will be a delight to hear and a delight to see.
Well, thank you all for coming out on a gorgeous spring evening. It's a huge pleasure to launch the US edition here today in the company of so many people that were kind enough to read manuscripts. Sonia, Deborah, Bob, all sitting there, people that saved me from multiple errors, and everything that I know about Gandharan sculpture, Deborah's taken me around the galleries here since I was sort of in short pants and taught me all this stuff. Anyway, it's very, very nice to be back here. I should say that I'm coming here as having just had my son on the same podium 3 weeks earlier, which is now going to be the shape of things to come. His book is out in a few months' time. I'm sort of feeling myself turn into some sort of crusty Kingsley Amis character, father of the more famous, that. Anyway. India is one of those parts of the world, such as Greece and China, which very early on in human history came up with deep and profound answers to the fundamental questions that man asked. What are we doing here? How do we live a moral life? What is our relationship with this world? How do we measure this world? What is the size of this world? What is the distance between us and the stars and the moon? The British and other European powers took the Greek answers to those questions and made them known around the world. More recently, the Chinese have been very good at telling their story, and particularly through the whole idea of the Silk Road, of which we're going to talk more in a second. But India and its answers are much less well known outside India. To give just one example, almost everyone in this room, I suspect, by the age of 6 or 7, knew the story about Archimedes shouting Eureka in his bath. Or by the age of 8 or 9 would have heard of Pythagoras and his theorem. But I suspect no one who is not of South Asian background here, however well educated, however many PhDs you have ever heard of the great Indian mathematicians, Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta, who are equally great figures. One, Aryabhatta calculated the circumference of the Earth almost exactly right, as early as 300 AD, also the distance to the moon, and the fact that the Earth travels around the sun, a heliocentric idea of the universe, 1,000 years before Galileo. And yet you can go around the universities of the West and no one will have heard of his name. It's much less Brahmagupta, who came up with the definition of zero. Now, these are major figures in world culture. Between them, Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta also came up with the numbers we use. In the West, we call them Arabic numbers, which we'll talk more again later. But we got them from the Arabs, so I suppose it's a reasonable name to call them, but the Arabs got them from the Indians. That's where it originated. And yet somehow, at some point in the 19th century, probably during the Victorian period, the fact that these numbers come from India has been forgotten. When they were first introduced to Europe, they were known as the modus Indorum, the Indian method. But that has now been forgotten. And I think it's part of that whole world where Macaulay could write gaily that a single shelf of a good English library is worth the entire native literature of India and Arabia. We laugh at those attitudes today, and yet in our education systems they continue, and we just do not learn about the contribution of India at all. This idea of the Silk Road, I think, is a good example of how, in a sense, a country can change its perception outside its own borders. But it's also an idea which has further diminished the reputation of India. This idea of a road stretching from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, an almost horizontal line across, if you like, the thin waste of Asia, passing through Iran, Anatolia, Iran, Central Asia, the Taklamakan Desert, the Gobi, and ending up in Loyang and Chang'an. But this idea, as you can see, completely ignores India. This is not a sort of made-up map. This is one taken at random from about the 40 books written on the Silk Road published last year alone. Equally, it could have come from one of the 2 exhibitions on the Silk Road in London last summer. One major one in the British Library and one in the British Museum. Major one in the British Museum and a small one in the British Library. And I think most people here will have assumed, as I always did, that the Silk Road is a sort of ancient idea that goes back to, with firm historical underpinnings, to classical sources. But it's not so. The idea of the Silk Road, in fact, was invented by a German geographer, Baron von Richthofen, in 1877, when he was designing a colonial railway between Berlin and Beijing. Never got built, but the name, the Seidenstraßen, came at that time. Entered the English language as late as 1936, when the Nazi-sympathizing Swedish explorer, Sven Hedin, had his memoirs translated into English. And it was only when I was at university in the 1980s that it really became a prominent idea, partly due to exhibitions in Washington and the Met. And now it's an idea which no one questions. It's become a fact of history. And it's also one that's been projected backwards from the time of Marco Polo. Look at this map. We have the great Byzantine port of Gaza, Tyre, Antioch, Palmyra, suggesting that this map is applicable to the classical period. In reality, this is nonsense. Complete nonsense. There is no evidence of any single diplomatic or trading mission passing from China to Rome or vice versa at any point in the classical period. In contrast, Strabo has an eyewitness account of seeing 250 vessels waiting in the Red Sea to travel on what he describes as an annual trading fleet, leaving the Roman world for India. Pliny talks about India as being the drain of all the precious metal in the world. And in rather sort of Trumpian terms, he complains about how there is a negative balance of trade between India and Asia. And indeed, the Romans charged a 30% tariff at the Red Sea ports. I'm not making this up. Some economic historians are now suggesting that maybe as much as a quarter of the Roman imperial budget came, you shouldn't tell this to Trump, but it comes from the customs take on the Red Sea ports at Berenike and Myos Hormos. So on one hand, we have a non-existent link between China and Rome, which is very well known and now assumed to be a fact and has become the basis for a geopolitical fact of the present day, which is the Belt and Road. And on the other hand, we have an actual, regular, massive annual trade between India and Rome, which is completely unknown outside the scholarly world and the small group of people that actually deal with this. And it's a very good example of historical groupthink, whereby something which is basically not true becomes widely believed and unquestioned. But a huge amount of scholarship is being done on this, and it's time that the reality is known. Now, just memorize that map for a second. Last year, Oxford University produced a map of Roman coin hoards that is a pretty good indication of where trade actually went. And this is the actual picture of classical trade. So each one of those orange dots is somewhere that a hoard of Roman coins has been found. Of course, centered on Western Europe, Italy, France, Spain, Greece, around the rim of the Mediterranean, a little tail going down the Nile. A couple in Yemen, a small scattering in Afghanistan. But look in the bottom right-hand corner. I'm afraid on this side of the thing you won't be able to see much, but there is a massive mash of red and orange dots, in particularly Kerala, but also Gujarat, at the mouth of the Indus and Sindh, at the mouth of the Ganges, Tamralipti, the port in Bengal, and all over Sri Lanka. That is where Roman trade actually went. There has never been a single Roman coin hoard ever found in China. So it's worth looking at this again. And I'm going to talk in the next 40 minutes about three forms of Indian thought that followed on the back of Indian trade. I'm going to talk about how Buddhism spread from a small sect on the banks of the Ganges in 5th century BC India to become the single biggest religious force in Asia. We're then going to talk about how much later, from the 5th and 6th century, Hinduism, Sanskrit, and ideas of Hindu kingship spread all the way from Kandahar down to Southeast Asia. And finally, I'm going to talk about maths and astronomy and astrology, and how Indian ideas on all three came to dominate, first of all, the Arab world under the Abbasids, and then finally got to Europe as late as the 12th century, giving us the number system we all use. So, to start with Buddhism. So, very briefly, the Buddha is a historical character, probably lived the mid-5th century, although there's still arguments about that among scholars. But what's extraordinary is that there's very little evidence that Buddhism left the area that he lived in. Born in Lumbini, just over the border in modern Nepal, had his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, now in Bihar, preached his first sermon at Sarnath, just outside Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh. And there's evidence of early stupas and early monastic buildings from that sort of period. But really, there's very little, other than some controversial ostraca and coins found in Sri Lanka and on the south coast, which could be early. There's very little evidence of its spread until 250 BCE, the Emperor Ashoka decides to embrace Buddhism. And he propels Buddhism from a local cult into a massive international force in a few generations. The three-lion symbol here from Sarnath is now one of the emblems of the modern Indian Republic on every passport and every banknote. Now, we have a reference in a Kandahar inscription to Ashoka sending what he calls Dharma ministers, what we would call missionaries, out into the world, which was still reeling from the death of Alexander the Great, where the different Macedonian generals were fighting out and dividing the world between them. But there's a reference in this Kandahar inscription to the Dharma ministers getting as far as Cyrene, which is modern Libya, a long way from India. Particularly, you see Buddhism spreading southwards through India, so that you get the extraordinary rock-cut monasteries like this at Bhaja outside Pune, where you get representations of a lost Indian architecture in bamboo and wood reproduced in stone here, including, I always rather like this sort of happy couple looking out of their balcony window, more couples here. So this was a sort of Indian bamboo tower block that we've lost the reality of, but preserved here in stone, cut out of a rock face, with the stupa as the focus of prayer, as it would be later in a Christian tabernacle, a representation of the divine presence. And it's around this time that we get the first paintings of Buddhism. At Ajanta, cave 9 and 10, 150 BC, you get the first paintings in the Buddhist world. This is later, but just worth putting up because it's almost the most beautiful painting ever painted. The Bodhisattva Padmapani, as Stella Kramrisch, the art historian, put it, caught in a gale of stillness with his lotus, hovering between enlightenment and this world, hesitating to cross over the boundary. And then we get, in Sri Lanka, the conversion of the king of Anuradhapura, and the whole island converts to Buddhism. And as recently as 2 years ago, this stupa is uncovered on the hilltop of Rajagala in central Sri Lanka with a Brahmi inscription saying this is the burial place of Minda. So this is one of the very first stupas in existence. And it looks like a prototype. Look at it compared to on the left, this sort of far more fancy stupa from centuries later. And Sri Lanka becomes another center of the Buddhist mission and sends out its own Buddhist missionaries to Pew, Burma, and to Java. And you get Buddhist monasteries founding sort of franchises, rather like sort of McDonald's or Marks and Spencer in Java. And this is a map which should be better known, but is rarely reproduced. This is the spread of Buddhism over the next 500 years. And one of the most extraordinary miracles, also one of the most extraordinary examples of the spread of Indian soft power in history. This may be the most remarkable spread of Indian soft power in history. Because there are so few Buddhists in India today, it's not trumpeted or in Indian textbooks. But never again would Indian ideas spread so quickly over such a vast region, and all entirely without military or political propulsion. By traders passing on. And the traders, we think of Buddhists as terribly otherworldly, and in Hollywood they sort of stand in as sort of symbols of mysticism. But the early Buddhist monasteries were very money-minded, like the monasteries of Western Europe before the Reformation. They lent money. We have inscriptions from one guy in Andhra Pradesh who said his father was a rice harvester, but thanks to a loan from a monastery was able to become a Mahanavika, a great sailor. and sails off to Malaysia, and then came back and repaid the monks. And all along these arrows, you can imagine monasteries having traders to stay. And indeed, there's an argument that has been made that those wonderful frescoes at Ajanta are part of a policy of pulling in rich patrons, that you have these lovely things, not just to encourage you to pray, but you have pictures of gorgeous girls on swings and sitting in pleasure gardens, partly in order to encourage rich patrons to come and donate money to your monastery and come and stay there. And look at the arrows, out of Sarnath and Bodh Gaya, through Mathura to Pakistan, Afghanistan and Bactria, other currents going up through Lhasa and Tibet to China and Mongolia and beyond to Siberia, through China to Korea and Japan, down from Canton, Guangzhou, to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Incredible breadth. And it's not just Buddhist, mystical Buddhist ideas which are traveling, ideas of geography, ideas of time, concepts of circular time in kalpas and yugas are passing on this way. A massive spread of Indian thought is taking place, unparalleled. I mean, it's very hard to think of many other examples in world history of ideas spreading so fast, so profoundly, so irrevocably that they alter this whole shape of much of Asia even today, and yet without a single shot being fired, a single arrow being shot, a single spear being thrown. It's an extraordinary claim to fame. And even today, we are discovering new areas where Buddhism went that we didn't know. This is from a wonderful archaeological site called Berenike, a Red Sea port. And this head of the Buddha was found in a trench in a temple to the goddess Isis, an ancient Egyptian temple. Now, this figure, this extraordinary face, this beautiful face, seems to be sort of Gandharan in style, and yet it's in not the schist of Gandhara, but the Proconnessian marble from the Marmara Sea, from the quarries opposite Istanbul. The tortellini curls, as the archaeologists nicely describe it, are drilled with a drill found only in Alexandria. So it seems to have been made in Alexandria. But there's some weird syncretism with the sun god going on. Look at Surya or Mithras or Sol Invictus with these rays of the sun. And this is commissioned by an Indian sea captain. We have the inscription to celebrate his safe arrival by sea from India. And this is the sort of picture we're getting by the 1st century. Now, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea sounds a bit of a mouthful. What it is really just the Lonely Planet or the Rough Guide of the 1st century AD. It's a Roman sailor, and he's writing how you can make a very nice profit if you sail from Myos Hormuz, translated here as Mussel Harbor, or Berenike in the Red Sea. And this is exactly where Strabo is seeing his 250 vessels waiting to sail. And this is an important part of the map. Tibet freezes over in winter. It thaws in summer. And those currents of hot air propel the monsoon winds outwards from India, which means that unlike Scotland, where I come from, where winds blow in all sorts of crazy directions most of the year, in India, uncharacteristically, the winds are very well behaved, and they head off in the spring in this direction and that direction, and then they blow backwards for the next 6 months. So if you are an Indian sailor in the early classical period, and once you've learnt to surf these winds, you can sail in just 2 months to the Roman world and back again. And this guide, the Periplus, has detailed remarks about every single port on the west coast of India, particularly Muziris, which is the great port of Kerala, Barigaza, which is the great port of Gujarat, and Barbaricum, which is roughly where modern Karachi is at the mouth of the Indus. And sailors went backwards and forwards in great fleets every single year, backwards and forwards. And yet we have no conception of this in most accounts of the classical period, written before the last 10 years. And there's also a whole world going on here on the way. We forget about Aksum and Adulis And if you look carefully in Indian art, there are these figures that look very like tall Ethiopian princes with their pages in their little frocks and tunics, coming and offering gifts before an Indian ruler. These are from Amaravati. This is the look at this cornrow hair. The whole world of the Red Sea trade that we've forgotten about and ignored, with black African kingdoms being part of this, and very much entwined in this system, as were the Sasanian Persians. There's frequent references to Sasanian vessels passing through these ports and Buddhist monks using the Sasanians to ships as ways of traveling towards China. One gets the feeling that this is a field of world history that's only just beginning to be written, and there's lots more to be said. But we now have some figures, thanks to this manuscript, the Mosiris Papyrus. The Mosiris Papyrus is just simply a shipping invoice of the sort made out in any port anywhere in the world every day. And like a modern shipping invoice, it has one column for the contents, another column for the value, and a third column for the tariffs, the customs take. What is inside this container that's traveling from Kerala to Egypt? Well, we have some pictures, funnily enough, improbably. And those pictures are in Sicily. And here, on a villa in Sicily, we have what presumably is a commission by a Roman captain who was involved in this trade. And here is a personification of India that seems to be based on a Mathura Yakshi, or some sort of Kushan Yakshi. And here she is. And you see, when she touches the tree, it blossoms. She's a figure of fertility. She's so sort of super fecund that she's only got to touch the tree and it bursts into flower. This is incidentally a motif that remains in Indian art right through into Rajput and Mughal period. Now, the Romans don't understand this image, so they just have her touching a tree. Nothing blossoms here. But they've got the busty, kind of voluptuous thing. They've understood that bit. In addition, we have her with silk, because the Periplus says very clearly the Romans get their silk not from China, they get it from Gujarat. And Pliny, who's this sort of huffy-puffy naval commander, regards sort of silk as almost sort of porno wear. It's like a sort of, sort of fancy lingerie or something from some dodgy shop in Soho. And he exactly makes the point that Roman women's limbs can be seen through the silk, exactly as it's portrayed here. And so they're buying silk, they're buying pepper. This is pepper vines. They're buying ivory. And in a nice sort of Gladiator 2 touch, they're buying circus animals, elephants and tigers, rather like the rhino in Elephant 2, not in Elephant 2, in Gladiator 2. And so there's this whole world which is there in the imagery, and it's there in the manuscripts, but we've just forgotten about it. And it's there in archaeology. This is an Indian Yakshi turning up in Pompeii. But we also have the reverse. We have these nice Egyptian Alexandrian glass beakers turning up in Afghanistan. We've got Russell Crowe over here. We've got the Pharos lighthouse, and we've got a vintage scenes of wine harvesting. And that turns up under the American Air Force Base in Bagram, of all places. Abandoned by Biden, shamefully, but we're not going to go there. And this influences the art of the Buddhist world. Here we've got a Coptic manuscript papyrus from Coptic Egypt that's remarkably like a Gandharan wall painting from Miran, the only Gandharan wall paintings that have survived. More specifically, we see, thanks to the influence of Roman art, we see aniconic images of the Buddha represented as a stupa, a flaming pillar, or the Dharma wheels, suddenly turning into a human figure in a toga, or hamapin. And this is arguably the first, the Bimaran reliquary, now in the British Museum, from a stupa on the Khyber Pass. But by the, this I think is here, isn't it? This is part of your collection. But by the second and third centuries, you've got these incredibly classical faces on the Buddha. Seen most obviously if you compare the image of Augustus. Look at the drapery of this to the image of the Bodhisattva from Peshawar. The Brits had read too much Kipling, as they often had, and they used to think of Gandharan art as being the lost legions of Alexander stuck in the Hindu Kush, converting to Buddhism. But it's nonsense, sadly, because the timing's wrong. The Bactrian Greeks disappear from history about 150 BCE, and these turn up from the 1st century AD onwards, and it's 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. So it's Roman art that's influencing this, not ancient Greek art. And these are contemporary Roman fashions and contemporary Roman models which are influencing this early Buddhist art. And passing into Afghanistan now, heading northwards, this very hybrid sort of classical stroke Indian art begins to head towards China through Mezainak. This is incidentally an example of the Buddhist monks being very commercially minded. Mezainak is on the largest copper deposit in the world, and the monks used to mine it. Now, sadly, the Chinese are about to mine it and destroy the entire archaeological site. Already before the fall of the Taliban, that was the barracks of the Chinese miners who were going to blow up the site. On through Bamiyan, the niche of the Buddha destroyed by the Taliban, and on into China, where we begin to get Gandharan-style images, but with very Chinese facial features. And so you see Buddhism initially as a religion of foreigners from the 1st century, but slowly making itself at home in China in the 2nd and 3rd century. You have Gupta bodhisattvas from Mathura echoing in these Gansu robes, and echoes of Ajanta and these wonderful heavenly Gandhavras or heavenly flying creatures in the middle of Western China. In some of them, fantastically sort of wacky. I don't know what they're smoking, the monks here, but the Buddha sort of sets off in flames, elephants turn blue. It's all very sort of after Woodstock, sort of in its coloring and psychedelia. But Buddhism becomes a major force in China and begins to compete at court with Taoism and Confucianism, and you get a competition between the different faiths and philosophies for influence at court. The big change comes with Xuanzang, with his backpack full of scrolls, and he comes to Nalanda, the great monastery, in order to find better and more authentic texts in the library there. But Nalanda is this extraordinary place that, again, we should know as well as we know the Library of Alexandria. Look, for example, at the plan. Where else have you seen square courtyards with a cloister garth and 2 stories of scholars' rooms? It's exactly the plan of an Oxbridge College today. And there's a very good argument that you could make that it passes from the Buddhist monasteries and universities like Nalanda through Afghanistan into the madrasas of early medieval Islam, through Al-Azhar, through North Africa, into Islamic Spain, and that the first universities of the West, Paris, Bologna, Salerno, and ultimately Oxford and Cambridge a century later, based themselves on this plan out of ideas transmitted through the Islamic world, but originating in Nalanda. And look at these extraordinary ruins of the library of Nalanda, 9 stories high, teaching the Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, astronomy, literature, and magic. And Xuanzang is like some sort of fresher, newly arrived at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard, absolutely thrilled by Nalanda. And in his memoirs, he writes about how it was 9 stories high and contained 3 divisions: the Ratnadadi, the Sea of Jewels; the Ratnasagara, the Ocean of Jewels; the Ratnaranjaka, the Jewel Adorned. The priests numbered 7,000. From morning until night, the monks engage in discussions. Old and young mutually help each other. The students diligently study without wasting a moment. The atmosphere of the monastery was solemn and dignified. So Xuanzang spends 20 years in Nalanda copying out manuscripts, and then manages to get them all home other than 1 boatload which sinks on the Indus at Attock. And when he gets back, he finds that the Tang Emperor Taizong is willing to build the great Wild Goose Pagoda, which still stands, possibly modeled on the Nalanda Library in Xi'an. But before we leave Nalanda, we have this extraordinary copper plate in Delhi, which records an expatriate college built by the king of Srivijaya and the endowment that he gives for it. So you have monks from Indonesia, Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, even Korea, coming all the way to Nalanda to study. And here, when he gets back, Xuanzang finds an improbable ally in a young princess called Wu Zetian. And Wu doesn't look much here, but she was clearly attractive enough to catch the eyes of Taizong, the great Tang emperor, and then somehow to pivot from his bed into his son's bed, Gaizong. So that when the old man dies, she doesn't get put in a monastery, or rather she does get put in a monastery, but she escapes and comes back to be first concubine, then empress, and then regent, and finally the only woman emperor in the whole of Chinese history. And because she's Buddhist, she's very important because she turns China briefly into a Buddhist kingdom. And you can get an idea of what she looks like at the time rather more clearly through the Chinese soap opera, which is about 250 parts long, and makes it very clear that she had charms which swung the fate of the nation. So she's regarded as a kind of Lady Macbeth figure today in China, and considered a thoroughly bad thing. But she's a very important part of our story because it's the high watermark of Indian influence in China. And this country, which is famous for never needing to take the slightest interest in foreign things at all, when the East India Company turn up in Beijing and at Chengde, trying to interest the Chinese in trade, the emperor says very smartly, "We have no need of your knickknacks." And this is slightly the attitude in the rest of Chinese history, except at this period when China goes over to an Indian philosophy and an Indian faith. It rolls back, and the Confucians and the Taoists come back a generation later, but for 50 years, it is a Buddhist kingdom. And exactly as that is happening, at the same time in Southeast Asia, Hinduism is making rapid inroads in Suvarnabhumi, the lands of gold. Now, we were talking about the massive trade between Rome and the west coast of India. With the fall of Rome, that ends like a guillotine. Suddenly, no more gold is arriving in southern India. And this creates an economic crisis in India, which had been rather like Saudi Arabia, I think, up to this point, where no one really had to get out of bed after sinking an oil well. And I think India had just been plucking peppercorns and slaughtering elephants and selling them to the Romans, and barely had to do a day's work, and just becoming incredibly rich. But with the fall of Rome, that gold ceases to come, and they need to look for new sources of gold. Where do they find it? Suvarnabhumi, the lands of gold in Southeast Asia, and particularly Suvarnadvipa, the island of gold, which is Borneo. And there is these extraordinary trading guilds, the 500, that are a bit like in Game of Thrones, the Iron Bank, for those of you that watch TV. And the trading guilds are these very powerful, the 500 are actually quite like the East India Company. They have an army, they have a corps of assassins to follow anyone who has murdered one of their number, and they have fortified forts, like later the East India Company will have Madras and Bombay and Calcutta. And they've set up, particularly looking for gold in Bujang, in the port of Okeo, in Champa, and you have this pivot of Indian interest from the west coast and Rome, now looking east to the river estuaries of Southeast Asia, where forest products, but particularly gold, is being sourced for the Indian elite. And merchants are now traveling in ever larger numbers in boats like this over the monsoon winds. And suddenly we start finding evidence of Indian religions in Southeast Asia. The Dvaravati wheels of law, all over Malaysia, and particularly around Bujang, and you have Buddhist monks, lingams, yonis, and images of Lord Shiva. Initially, again, one gets the impression it's for the Indian traders, but it seems to spread locally after a while. And particularly at Okeo, at the mouth of the Mekong Delta, you get these extraordinary canals crossing from one side to the other. And if you go up these canals, you end up at Angkor Baray, where Sonia had an exhibition of all this lovely stuff. Did it come here, or was it just it was here? It was in the Freer. And inside Ashram Maharose, and in the cave beneath it, you get these extraordinary early images of Lord Vishnu and Lord Krishna. But already from the beginning, you'd never confuse it with an Indian sculpture. And it's very important to realize that what you're getting here is not a sort of colonial imposition of Indian ideas. You're getting the sowing of Indian seeds in foreign soil that's growing up to produce new and strange flowers. So, for example, here we've got Jayavarman II, one of the founders of the Angkor dynasty, and he's showing himself as Lord Vishnu with a discus and a conch. You'd never see Rajaraja Chola shown as Lord Shiva. You'd see him with Lord Shiva, but never as Lord Shiva. This is something different. And this is the sort of thing that's going on. You've got a local king, let's call him Kudunga, which is a name we get in one inscription. And Kudunga's son is suddenly calling himself Mullavarman, or Suryavarman. He's suddenly taking on a Sanskrit name. There's an Abhisheka ceremony. He's converted into a sort of Hindu king. He's given a relationship with the great Hindu gods. And a whole bunch of Brahmins are turning up from South India with their Brahmins' cords and their top knots of hair at these courts. And the Chinese ambassadors are slightly confused to find all these Indians turning up and speaking Sanskrit. And they report from the 5th century onwards that these guys are taking over. And with them, they bring their script. This is the Pallava Grantha script, which is the basis. So in the North India, you have all those scripts, the Devanagari scripts, which have the washing line, and the letters hang down from it. But you can't do a washing line, a straight line, on palm because it cuts the palm. So you have to develop circular letters, which can, with a pen, not penetrate the palm. And so this, developed probably in Kanchipuram, becomes the basis of Tamil and Malayalam, but also the basis of every single pre-Islamic script in Southeast Asia, Mon, Khmer, Pew, and so on. And so you have the language of Sanskrit, which is perfectly reproduced in inscriptions that show no sign of sort of pidgin or provincial misunderstanding. They're orthographically and grammatically perfect, and often slightly nerdy. The Khmers like their Indian literature, and they show off their literacy. So that, for example, at the temple of Bante Shre, we have a prime minister writing the reading list that he's set for his younger brother, with all the different books he expects his brother to learn. And they contain obvious texts like the Gita and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Puranas, but also really obscure references to Tamil ammas and mother goddesses who are unknown even in Andhra Pradesh but turn up in Cambodia. So then we get the next stage, when the whole landscape begins to be transformed into an Indic landscape. A new Ayodhya, the capital of Lord Ram, is founded outside Bangkok, what is now modern Bangkok. A new Kurukshetra appears in Laos. Even according to one etymology, the Mekong, of which this is one of the headwaters north of Angkor, the river gets sacralized with the yonis and lingams and turned into a sacred river. And even some scholars think that the etymology of Mekong is just a Khmer pronunciation of Ma Ganga, Mekong. So you get the landscape transformed into an Indic landscape. All the great Shaivite shrines suddenly reappear as Khmer pyramids. And suddenly we find all the temples of India in a slightly transformed form. So here's the Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram, and here is Gadong Songo. Here is this wonderful temple above a billowing clouds of sulfur coming out of a volcanic site on the island of Java. And by the 8th and 9th centuries, these extraordinary sculptures are being sculpted with huge classical perfection at places like Prambanan. Here you have a 250-part sort of strip cartoon of the Ramayana, centuries before such a thing is sculpted in India. And the scale of the spires and the scale of the temples become greater than those in India because the kingdoms are bigger than those in India. Srivijaya is bigger than any Indian kingdom. The Khmer Empire is the greatest Hindu empire ever built. And they can afford to build bigger and better than the Indians where these ideas have originated. So you get ideas from stupas in Bihar transformed into Borobudur on a much greater scale with this enormous mandala shape stupa rising. And it's like a sort of engine of enlightenment. You enter, there's at the bottom layer, there's the images of the life of the Buddha, and then you get ever more obscure Mahayana texts until you come out on the terrace at the top, gazing out over the landscape through these lattice stupas. It's all incredibly complex and highly thought through. And then finally, the final culmination is Angkor in the 12th century, the largest Hindu temple ever built, the largest medieval religious monument ever built. Absolutely whacking great, enormous. 4 times the size of the Vatican City is the area contained within the outer moat. 1.2 million people in Greater Angkor in the 12th century when London had about 20,000. But again, different from India. In the central tower, you have the ashes of the founder, Suryavarman II. Rather like a Buddhist stupa, but it's in a Hindu temple. You'd never find the ashes of a Hindu king in a temple in India. You'd find them on the Ghats, you'd find them outside the city on the river or in a cenotaph, but never in the middle of a royal temple. So it's inspired by India, but it's swum off on its own trajectory that Tagore understood very clearly when he went in the 1920s. He says, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her. So finally, maths. Here is 270. Here is our numbers. And they begin in Gupta and Mauryan India. So highly sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, the study of Jyotisa, which is both mathematics and astronomy and astrology, all rolled into one, under the Gupta kings. Here we have the Gupta king Chandragupta II, headless now, bowing before Varaha, who's just rescued Bhudevi, the earth, from the floods. A Naga king with his hoods is worshipping while his Varaha's foot is sitting on his coils. And it's at this time that we get Aryabhatta coming up with all these wonderful ideas of mathematics, measuring the circumference of the earth. And it is in Cambodia that we get the first zero, and a dated zero. And then we get in our current form of zero for the first time in Gwalior in the 8th century. Now, we just don't know this. This is where our numbers come from. Starts off with Brahm, 6 and 7 already there. This is the Gwalior inscription with the 0 that we just saw. And then it goes off in 3 different directions, through Sanskrit and Devanagari, one direction, through the East Arabic numbers still in use in the Arab world, and then the West Arabic numbers in Morocco and Islamic Spain, which become our numbers by the 16th century. That should be in every textbook, in every school in the world, but no one remembers this thing. It's an unknown gift from India. And Modi should stop doing sort of World Yoga Day and start doing World Maths Day and World Zero Day. Though we'd lose that rather nice picture of him in his leotard doing his... How does it get to the Middle East? Well, improbably through a Disney character. The story gets stranger still. I'm sure you've all watched the Disney Aladdin. You'll remember the villain of the piece is Jafar. Well, Jafar is a real character. He is one of the Barma kids, and the Barma kids were originally the Pramukhs. The Pramukh just means boss in Sanskrit. And they were the bosses of the Buddhist monastery of Naubahar outside Balkh. They convert to Islam, but they are Sanskrit literate, and one of their grandfathers studied maths in Kashmir. And the grandson ends up as vizier of Baghdad, and he calls to Sind for a copy of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And it's partly because they're so good at numbers that the Barmakids have risen up, because they were originally the accountants of the Abbasid Revolution. They were doing the army accounts and did them so well that the Abbasids won, and then they take over Baghdad. So the Barmakids bring Indian mathematics to the Arab world. And the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, the great Sind Hind, as the Arabs call it, is translated by Al-Khwarizmi. And he writes the snappily titled, The Compendious Book of Calculating by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. Important to note that he calls it Hindu calculation. It's not like the Arabs appropriate this. They acknowledge it as an Indian system. But because it's such a mouthful, you should hear it in Arabic, people know it by a nickname, and that nickname is Al-Jabr, where we get our word algebra. While Al-Khwarizmi's name gives us our name, algorithm. So algorithms and algebra, these basic stuff of Elon Musk and Facebook and every twist of our modern lives comes from this encounter of Indian learning in the Arab world. But it doesn't stop there. Along with chess, another Indian invention which passes at the same time along the same routes, it passes from Sind, where the great Sind Hind comes from. The embassy from Sind gets to Baghdad with the copy of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta in 776. We have a great account of its arrival. And they also bring a whole load of Brahmins to help interpret the text, and also a bunch of doctors to bring Indian medicine to the Arab world. And they found a Bimaristan, they found a hospital in Baghdad using presumably Ayurvedic techniques of charaka. And initial attempts to translate this stuff, because it's all written in very complex rhyming Sanskrit that needs a whole bunch of commentaries, which is why the Brahmins have been brought along too, fail. The early versions are not good until a young man comes from here. And Khwarazm is now Khiva in modern Uzbekistan, and he comes from Khiva to Baghdad, and Al-Khwarizmi, because he's from Khwarazm, translates this, and his translation goes right through the Arab world. And by 990s, Christian monks in Barcelona, just beyond Arab world, in Reconquista, Spain, are using Indian numbers for the first time. And in Toledo, Said al-Andalusi writes this wonderful encomium to the brilliance of Indian mathematicians, saying the greatest mathematicians in the world come from India, and they've invented zero and other wonderful things with incredible precision, understanding the contribution of Indian mathematicians. But it doesn't take off. In Northern Europe, people are still using MCV XV1 divided by CCMVC. Try doing that at home for your school homework. And it's only in 1192 that Pisa founds a trading post in Algeria at Bujaia. And the guy who's sent to run it brings his kid, and the kid goes to the local school, learns Arabic, and also learns Arabic numbers, which is being taught to any old teenager, thanks to the fact that Al-Khwarizmi's translation is so accessible, unlike the Sanskrit originals. And that kid goes back to Pisa and discovers that all his school friends are still doing division by MCCCMVC. So he writes a book. And luckily for us, the guy who goes back to Pisa and does the translation into Latin is none other, luckily for us, as Fibonacci. And Fibonacci takes it to the court of, or rather, the court of Frederick II comes to Fibonacci. Fibonacci is visited by the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. And Frederick II then introduces him, very important walk-on role for the Scots at this point, very important. Michael Scott is the court astronomer. Anyway, Michael Scott tells Fibonacci that it's a wee bit theoretical, your Liber Abaci, he gets him to do a second edition that contains money lending and usury and weights and measures, all the practical things that a merchant will need. And it's the second edition of the Liber Abaci that goes viral, if you like, in Renaissance Italy. And it leads to the growth of the Italian banking, so you get the rise of the Medici. One of the people that is using Fibonacci is none other than Piero della Francesca. And Piero della Francesca uses Fibonacci to work out perspective and to write 3 mathematical treatises. We think of Piero as the great early Renaissance painter, but at the time he's thought of as the great mathematician. And he writes 3 mathematical treatises on the Hindu method and Fibonacci, the modus andorum. And after he dies, that volume is taken by his friend Fra Luca Pacioli to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, who's painting a picture of the Last Supper in Milan. You've got it. It's Leonardo da Vinci. So in a very nice, simple few steps, you go from Leonardo to Fibonacci, Fibonacci to Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Khwarizmi to Brahmagupta, Brahmagupta to Aryabhatta, and Pataliputra in the 3rd century. So it's a straightforward line from early Indian Gupta mathematics to Leonardo da Vinci developing helicopters in Milan, which is a very nice thing. Unfortunately, what happens next is that it goes to England and you get the East India Company, and I'm sorry for that. So, thank you very much.